They said I didn't belong. Not with them. Not in that room. Not at that table lined with crystal glasses and practiced smiles. To them, I was always the difficult one, too serious, too ambitious, too sharp, edged for comfort. I didn't coo over family gossip, I didn't flirt at holiday dinners, and I sure as hell didn't beg for approval from people who mistook volume for value. So, when I walked into that skyscraper ballroom in downtown Chicago, floor 47, ceiling like a cathedral, live jazz bouncing off the marble, I knew I wasn't just crashing a party. I was walking into the very space they thought I'd never reach. The invitation wasn't even meant for me, not really. It came from a generic event coordinator, and the only message from my cousin Tessa's bride-to-be was a text that read, "If you do come, maybe tone it down this time. No legal lectures. Just good vibes." As if the only version of me worth inviting was the one who stayed silent. As if showing up with dignity was some kind of disruption. But they didn't know who I'd become. They didn't know that the woman they once called unlikable now led legal strategy for one of the most powerful firms in the Midwest. That the girl they laughed at for carrying law textbooks to family barbecues now sat across from billion-dollar CEOs and called the shots they were too scared to make. And they sure as hell didn't know that I wasn't attending this event as a guest. I was here as a name on the announcement list, a name on the next board of directors, a name they'd have to say out loud after years of pretending I didn't exist. So no, I didn't dress to impress. I dressed to be remembered. And when they finally realized who I was, what I was, you could feel the temperature in that room drop 10 degrees. Not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't have to. Her name is Evelyn Hart, and for most of her life, she was the one they talked about like she wasn't in the room. The girl they glanced past during holidays. The one who never quite fit in with the family's version of what a woman should be: soft, agreeable, easily impressed. She wasn't. Even as a child, Evelyn carried herself with a kind of quiet seriousness that unsettled people. She asked too many questions. She read too much. She never laughed at jokes that weren't funny. When other girls were learning how to smile through discomfort, Evelyn was studying contract law at 14, not because anyone told her to, but because she wanted to know how the world worked before it tried to break her. She came from a family that valued charm over character, style over substance. Her cousin Tessa's golden child was everything Evelyn wasn't. Bright, bubbly, blonde. The type who could lie with a laugh and get away with it. At every birthday, every reunion, every forced family brunch, Tessa sparkled while Evelyn shrank. Not because she wanted to, but because being invisible was safer than being misunderstood. Her parents didn't mean to overlook her. At least, that's what she told herself for years. They were just busy. Too busy to attend the regional debate championships she won. Too tired to read the scholarship letters she earned. Too distracted to notice that their eldest daughter had built an entire life of excellence in the shadows of a family that never once said, "We're proud of you." So Evelyn stopped expecting recognition. Stopped asking to be seen. She left home with a backpack full of textbooks and a head full of reasons why love shouldn't have to be earned in silence. While Tessa was flying to Cabo with her fiancé and bragging about her latest Pilates certification, Evelyn was pulling 16-hour shifts at a nonprofit legal clinic, defending clients who couldn't afford the justice they deserved. While the family group chat buzzed with baby photos and mimosa recipes, Evelyn was studying for the bar exam with 2 jobs and no sleep. She passed first try. Top 1%. No one called. Eventually, she stopped sending updates. She stopped showing up. By 37, Evelyn Hart had become everything they never imagined. General counsel at a Fortune 500 firm. Board advisor. Mentor to dozens of young women who saw in her what she was never allowed to see in herself. She had influence. She had power. She had peace. But she never had closure. Because somewhere deep in the corners of her memory, there was still that little girl sitting at the edge of the family table, holding her tongue, wondering if she'd ever be enough just as she was. And now, 10 years later, she's walking into a room full of those same people. Only this time, she's not the outsider. She's the one they'll wish they had listened to. The one they tried to forget, but who came back so quietly, they didn't even notice. Until she was already standing center stage. The city of Chicago has always had a certain weight to it. Not just in the way the skyscrapers claw at the sky, or how the wind cuts down your spine in February, but in the way it demands your attention without ever asking for it. It's a city of power, of grit, of stories buried beneath polished glass and corner offices. A city that remembers who built it and quietly watches who rises within it. For Evelyn Hart, it was the perfect place to disappear and rebuild. She didn't move there to chase glamour. She wasn't drawn by the lights, or the Riverwalk, or even the career prospects. She moved to Chicago because it was vast enough to swallow the past and sharp enough to keep her honest. It didn't care where you came from, only what you could withstand. And Evelyn, she could withstand a lot. After law school, she took a job most of her classmates wouldn't even consider. Legal compliance assistant for a struggling logistics firm, 60 hours a week. No prestige, no mentorship. But Evelyn wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to learn, to observe, to sharpen. And when the company collapsed 2 years later, due to mismanaged funds and a poorly concealed embezzlement scheme, Evelyn was the one who found the paper trail. She drafted the internal report. She sat across from the CEO and handed him his own confession, line by line. That moment changed everything. Word traveled quickly in the city's legal circles. A young woman, quiet, precise, unshakable, who didn't just know the law, but understood how it worked in real life. Within months, Evelyn had 5 offers on the table. By the following year, she was leading internal investigations for Delcroft Capital, one of the most influential venture firms in the Midwest. Delcroft wasn't a typical investment house. It dealt in risk-big bets on biotech, AI, clean energy, litigation funding. And risk breeds secrets. That's where Evelyn came in. She wasn't there to shake hands or sign NDAs. She was there to find what no one else wanted to see. To read between lines others skipped over. To ask questions that made grown men shift in their leather chairs. Inside Delcroft's high-rise headquarters, floor 47, a full glass view of Lake Michigan, Evelyn built her domain. No plaques. No ego. Just results. Every case she touched became cleaner. Every deal she cleared stayed cleared. And when leadership needed someone to navigate the murky legal waters of a merger, a scandal, or a silent whistleblower, they called her. By 37, she was promoted to executive legal director, a title that didn't just look good on paper. It carried weight. It placed her 2 seats from the CEO at every meeting. It gave her a say in everything from executive contracts to acquisition due diligence. She had built this not with handshakes or backroom favors, but with unshakable precision. Brick by brick. File by file. And yet, no one from her family knew. Not because she kept it a secret, but because no one ever asked. So when that invitation arrived, gilded paper, scented envelope, Tessa's name in oversized cursive, Evelyn knew what it meant. They hadn't included her for who she was. They still thought she was background noise. What they didn't know was that she now sat on the board of the very company hosting the event. And that the woman they used to ignore, she now had the power to decide who stayed in the room and who was politely shown the exit. It started, as these things often do, with a piece of mail that looked too beautiful to be cruel. The envelope was thick, elegant, the kind of stationery that whispered money before you even opened it. Ivory cardstock edged in rose gold foil, monogrammed initials embossed like a crest, TM and G.M. in a calligraphy font so ornate it practically rolled its eyes at you. Evelyn held it in her hands for a moment before opening it. She already knew what it was. Inside, the official invitation to the engagement gala of Tessa Monroe and Grant Morrison, a name Evelyn recognized, of course. Grant was the rising star CEO of Delcroft Capital, The very company where Evelyn had spent the last 5 years dismantling legal risks and cleaning up after executives like him. She read the invitation twice. Nowhere did it say her full name. No, Miss Evelyn Hart, Executive Legal Director. Just Evelyn. Like an afterthought. No +1. No personal note. Not even a line acknowledging they hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. It was the kind of invitation sent to remind you you're not really included. Just tolerated. Formality disguised as kindness. She almost laughed. Almost. But what came next wasn't funny. Later that night, a text buzzed through on her phone, a known number at first glance, but she didn't need the contact saved to recognize the tone. Tessa Monroe. Heave. Just wanted to say, if you do decide to come, no pressure. Maybe keep things light? Grant's family is kind of formal, you know? Like champagne and small talk vibes, not depositions, just don't overthink it. Would love to see you. Night. Evelyn stared at the screen. It was every microaggression, every backhanded comment, every childhood dismissal, condensed into 3 sentences and a pink heart emoji. Keep things light. Don't be so serious. Please don't ruin the mood by being you. It wasn't the first time Tessa had done this. In fact, it was classic. At 13, she'd told their cousins Evelyn was adopted. At 21, she'd laughed when Evelyn said she wanted to go into law. You'll be one of those courtroom ladies with no social life, she had sneered, twirling her mimosa. And now, here she was, engaged to a CEO Evelyn worked beside on a daily basis, though Tessa clearly had no idea of that. Still treating Evelyn like the outsider. Still assuming she'd show up in a drab pantsuit and talk about ethics while everyone else posed for champagne selfies. But Evelyn wasn't offended. Not anymore. Because Tessa hadn't changed, but Evelyn had. She had outgrown the need to be liked. She had risen so far beyond the limits their family tried to place on her that she could stand in the same room, be called extra, and still outrank them all without raising her voice. She looked back at the text, reread it once, and then smiled. It wasn't a smirk, it wasn't bitter. It was the smile of someone who finally understood that people like Tessa weren't threats. They were mirrors reflecting back everything you had already outgrown. And so, Evelyn RSVP'd with a quiet yes. No explanation, no apology, no warning. Because sometimes, you don't need to crash a party. You just need to arrive prepared. For the moment they realize they invited the wrong version of you. There was a time when Evelyn Hart thought being invisible was safer than being seen. When she was young, she didn't have the words to describe it, the subtle ache of being tolerated instead of treasured. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It came in small doses, like drops of vinegar in a glass of milk. A forgotten birthday. A second-hand sweater wrapped in tissue paper and handed over like it was something new. A quiet laugh from her mother when Tessa called Evelyn the encyclopedia with shoes. She was the oldest, but you wouldn't know it by how they spoke to her always, as if she was a visiting guest in her own home. While Tessa got piano lessons, ice skating trips, and monogrammed towels, Evelyn got expectations. Be helpful. Be polite. Be quiet. By the time she was 10, she knew the rules of survival. Stay out of the way, don't complain, and never interrupt the golden child. Tessa Monroe was the kind of girl people adored for no particular reason. Her laugh was too loud, her stories rarely made sense, but she sparkled when she spoke, so no one seemed to care. She could lie and then blame it on confusion. She could cry and get out of punishment. She could forget Evelyn's name in public, and their mother would still smooth her hair and say, "Oh, that's just Tessa being Tessa." It wasn't that Evelyn was unloved. It was that her love came with conditions. She had to earn it with silence. With straight A's, with perfectly folded laundry and color-coded notebooks. No one asked if she was okay. No one noticed when she stopped bringing home friends. No one came to her regional debate tournament, not even when she placed first. She still remembered that drive home, trophy in her lap, while her father nodded off in the passenger seat. He hadn't asked about the final round. He hadn't asked how it felt to win. He just said, "Make sure your sister gets dinner." So she did, like always. The older she got, the more obvious it became. Tessa was the show, Evelyn was the structure. Tessa danced, Evelyn carried. Tessa made the noise. Evelyn held the silence. And still, she didn't rebel, didn't scream, didn't run. She turned inward toward books, toward arguments that followed logic, not favoritism, toward a future where people listened because they had to, not because they liked the way she looked in a dress. She applied to law school in secret, got in on scholarship, graduated early. When she told her family, her mother blinked. "Law, isn't that a bit cold?" Her father muttered, "You'll need to find a man who can handle that." And Tessa? She laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the idea of Evelyn in a courtroom commanding attention was too foreign to comprehend. "You?" she said, twirling her wine glass. "You're gonna make arguments for a living? You don't even like parties." Evelyn didn't reply. Not then. Because some truths don't need defense. They just need time. And Evelyn was patient. While they were busy underestimating her, she was becoming the kind of woman they'd one day be forced to introduce, with a smile that couldn't quite hide the shame of how long it took them to see her. At some point, Evelyn Hart stopped explaining, not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she realized no one was listening. Not really. People didn't ask to understand her. They asked to confirm what they already believed. They weren't seeking truth. They were seeking comforting assurance that the version of Evelyn they had invented in their heads was still intact. So, she let them keep it. She let them think she was cold, that she was too intense, too career-focused, too serious to be close to. She let them tell stories about her half-true, poorly remembered, comfortably distant. Because trying to correct them felt like screaming into a tunnel, echo after echo, and still no reply. She used to fight it. Used to try just a little to be more likable, more palatable. She'd soften her tone, hide the sharp edges of her intelligence, laugh politely when someone made a patronizing remark about strong women being lonely. But over time, it became exhausting. Why explain yourself to people who have no interest in revising the script? So Evelyn chose silence. Not the kind that seethes. Not the kind that waits for revenge. But the kind that liberates. Because when you stop performing, you start becoming. And for the first time in her life, Evelyn was becoming exactly who she was meant to be. She poured everything into her work not as a distraction, but as a foundation. Each late night at the office, every quiet win in a conference room, every contract she reviewed line by line, it all added up. To independence, to clarity, to a voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. She stopped replying in the family group chat. Stopped flying in for holidays where she'd be seated next to strangers and introduced as the cousin who works in legal stuff. She stopped correcting them when they got it wrong. Stopped explaining where she worked, what she did, or why she hadn't settled down yet. Let them guess. Let them fill in the blanks with whatever made them feel better. Meanwhile, she built something solid. A career with weight, a reputation with reach, a life that didn't need decoration or validation. She learned how to sit in boardrooms without shrinking, how to say no without guilt, how to walk into a room without asking permission. She didn't need to prove her worth anymore. Not to people who were never interested in seeing it to begin with. And when they finally noticed years later, often by accident, it didn't feel satisfying. It felt irrelevant. Because their recognition wasn't the goal. Peace was. And she had found it quietly, methodically, on her own terms. So when that invitation arrived, and Tessa's little message followed, Evelyn didn't feel the urge to defend herself. She didn't type out a paragraph, didn't lecture, didn't correct the record. She simply RSVP'd and smiled. Let them build their story. Because this time, she wasn't coming to explain. She was coming to exist fully, visibly, undeniably. And that was more than enough. Evelyn Hart didn't pack a statement dress. She didn't call a stylist, didn't schedule a blowout, didn't ask anyone for advice on what to wear to the kind of event designed for optics and introductions. She wasn't trying to impress. She wasn't aiming to show them. She'd already won. What she chose instead was precision. A tailored black sheath dress, clean lines, modest cut, no sequins, no lace. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't trendy. It was the kind of dress you wore when you weren't looking to compete because you were already in control. Her heels were low. Her makeup, soft. The only accessory she wore was a slim silver watch gifted to her by a retired judge who once told her, "A woman who keeps her own time doesn't need anyone else's permission." And if she booked her own hotel, not the one listed in the invitation block, because she didn't want to bump into old relatives in the hallway or be pulled into fake hugs over lukewarm lobby coffee. She flew in the night before, alone, with a single carry-on and a clear purpose. Be present. Be still. Say nothing. Until it matters. This wasn't a reunion. This was a reckoning. And Evelyn didn't come for closures. Came for clarity. She reviewed the agenda. She knew the flow of the event. Cocktail hour. CEO remarks. Engagement toast. Board announcement. She knew where she would be seated, not because anyone told her, but because she had quietly ensured her name appeared on the internal RSVP list as both an attendee and an incoming board appointee. They wouldn't be able to ignore her, not because she'd force herself into the spotlight, but because she was part of the reason the spotlight existed. Delcroft didn't just rent out the rooftop ballroom at the Marston Tower for the gala. They were celebrating a new era of leadership reshuffling executive roles, showcasing their expanded legal and governance team. And Evelyn Hart was the only woman being added to that table. The irony was almost poetic. Tessa thought she was inviting her cousin to a party. She didn't realize she was inviting a partner to the firm her fiancé worked for. A partner with voting rights. A partner with authority over litigation strategy, ethics oversight, and most ironically executive background vetting. Evelyn didn't plan to say any of that. She didn't need to. Because power, real power, doesn't introduce itself. It lets others stumble into the truth. Right as the room goes quiet. That night, before the gala, Evelyn stood in front of her hotel mirror. No big speech. No affirmations. Just a single breath. A reminder. You're not here for revenge. You're here because you earned the right to exist without shrinking. And that was the plan. No performance. No scene. Just presence undeniable and calm. In a room full of people who had spent years pretending she didn't matter. Until now. The lobby of the Marston Tower smelled like orchids and ambition. Evelyn arrived exactly 5 minutes early. Not 10. Not late. 5. Just enough to stay unnoticed, just enough to see how the room operated before stepping in. A hostess in a black blazer glanced at her clipboard, smiled politely, and handed her a glass of champagne without asking her name. No red carpet, no handshake, no. It's an honor to meet you. Just protocol. And that was fine. Evelyn didn't come for recognition. She came to listen. She entered the ballroom like someone who'd done it 100 times because she had. She'd closed deals in rooms just like this, had lunch with senators under lights no less crystal than these. The difference tonight was that no one expected her to matter. And that was exactly the point. The room buzzed with the kind of self-importance only wealth and shallow connections could buy. Men in overpriced suits exchanged practiced laughter. Women balanced stilettos and flutes of champagne like they'd trained for this since prom. And in the center of it all, as always, was Tessa Monroe. Sequins. Spray tan. The same laugh Evelyn remembered from childhood, loud enough to reach every corner, empty enough to mean nothing. Tessa didn't see her at first. But when she did, her smile froze. Not because she was surprised Evelyn came, but because she hadn't expected her to look like that. Tailored, elegant, effortless, not overdressed, not underdressed, just wrong enough to feel threatening. Tessa walked over, flanked by two women Evelyn vaguely remembered from some family gathering years ago. "Evelyn," she said, voice tight with performative warmth. "You look professional." Again. There it was. Not a compliment. A warning. Wrapped in chiffon and casual disdain. Evelyn smiled gently. "It's good to see you too, Tessa." "Did you fly in this morning?" Tessa asked, eyes darting down at the black dress. "You always go with black, huh?" Makes a statement. Very serious. "Some of us don't do sparkle," Evelyn replied, smooth as glass. "Besides, someone has to balance the room." And 10. One of Tessa's friends let out a tight laugh. Tessa blinked, clearly unsure whether she'd just been insulted. She recovered quickly. "Well, just try not to make things, too heavy. Grant's family is big on appearances. They ask a lot of questions." Evelyn held her gaze. "Then maybe," she said softly, "they'll finally get real answers." It was said without venom. No heat. But it landed like a pin pulled from a grenade. Tessa blinked again, forced a laugh, and waved it off. Classic Evelyn, always intense. Then she turned and flitted away, already mid-giggle, disappearing into a crowd too eager to adore her to ever wonder what was behind that perfect smile. Evelyn stood still for a moment, sipping her champagne. That word again, intense. As if depth were a flaw. As if clarity were a threat. She looked around the room, scanning the space. And for a split second, Evelyn remembered what it felt like to sit at the kids' table while Tessa played hostess to relatives who couldn't pronounce Evelyn's major. But that was a long time ago. Now, she wasn't a guest. She wasn't a background character. She was the storm they'd invited in. Without checking the forecast, dinner had come and gone, and so had most of Evelyn's appetite. The plate in front of her some oversauced duck confit remained untouched, growing cold like the space around her. No one had bothered to ask if she wanted wine. No one had asked who she was. The servers didn't look twice, and that was the part she found almost funny. Because this room, this party, this carefully curated event was technically being hosted in her honor too. They just didn't know it yet. Evelyn watched from her table near the back of the ballroom, half obscured by a centerpiece of imported lilies. People moved around her like she was furniture, another dark silhouette at the edge of polished floors and pastel conversations. Tessa was glowing under the chandelier, posing for photos beside Grant, laughing like nothing could touch her. Evelyn counted 5 different toasts, so fair, each more performative than the last. Childhood anecdotes, inside jokes, stories soaked in nostalgia and revisionist memory. Not once had anyone mentioned Evelyn. Not her name. Not her presence. Certainly not her position. She leaned back in her chair just as a hush swept through the room. The CEO of Delcroft Capital, a silver-haired man named Douglas Vance, had stepped onto the makeshift stage near the grand piano. He tapped the microphone twice, clearing his throat. "Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank you all for being here tonight, not just to celebrate an engagement, but to mark a new chapter for Delcroft's leadership as well." There it was. Evelyn set her glass down, gently, deliberately. "Tonight, we welcome a new addition to our board of directors. A voice that has quietly guided our most complex legal negotiations for years. Someone with unshakable integrity, tireless precision, and a gift for making the truth unavoidable." Heads began to turn. Mostly out of habit, maybe curiosity. But not out of recognition. Not yet. Please join me in congratulating the newest member of our executive board, Evelyn Hart, executive legal director, and now Delcroft board partner. It was like the room exhaled and forgot how to breathe again. The silence was immediate, uncomfortable, electric. Some people clapped, most didn't. They were still processing. From across the room, Evelyn saw Tessa freeze mid-sip. Her smile flickered like a power outage behind her eyes. Grant blinked, then slowly turned, confused. You could almost hear the calculation happening in real time. Evelyn? Evelyn Hart? That Evelyn? And then, suddenly, People were whispering. Phones lit up under tablecloths. LinkedIn searches launched with frantic thumbs. A woman 2 tables over leaned toward her husband. Wait, didn't she handle the Lawson ethics case last year? Another voice more distant, but sharp. I think she was on Bloomberg last month. Something about regulatory reform. Evelyn didn't stand. Not yet. She didn't wave. Didn't smile. She simply lifted her eyes, met Tessa's across the room and held them, steady and quiet. No malice. No triumph. Just truth. Because the real power of a moment like that isn't in what you say. It's in what you no longer need to explain. And in that moment, for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Hart was seen. Not as someone's cousin. Not as a placeholder. Not as the quiet one in black. But as exactly who she was, and always had been. It didn't take long. The clapping faded. The background music resumed. Conversations stumbled awkwardly back into motion, like dancers unsure of the next step. But the air had shifted. Evelyn didn't have to move, people came to her. A few executives nodded her way. One older man, clearly embarrassed he hadn't recognized her, made a point to say, "We've heard your name more than once. It's a pleasure to finally put a face to the results." But Evelyn was only half listening. Her eyes were on the edge of the room watching as Tessa and Grant conferred in low voices near the bar. They looked cornered, unprepared, exposed. And then, as expected, Grant approached. He was smooth about it, of course he was. That was his whole personality. That effortless charm, polished confidence, the practiced voice of a man used to controlling the room. But this time, he didn't quite have it. "Evelyn," he said, tone light but cautious. I guess congratulations are in order." She looked up slowly, folding her hands in her lap. "Thank you, Grant." "So, legal director?" he asked, pretending not to already know. "And board partner? That's impressive." Tessa never mentioned. She tilted her head, calm and clear. She didn't know. He blinked. "Really? I assumed." "Exactly," Evelyn said, voice low but sharp. "You assumed." There was no bite. Just truth delivered clean and cold. Before Grant could recover, Tessa appeared beside him. Her expression carefully assembled, but her eyes were frantic. "Ave," she began, the nickname suddenly sounding cheap in her mouth. "Why didn't you say anything? Why not just tell me you were—" "What, Tessa?" Evelyn interrupted gently. "That I was someone worth mentioning?" Tessa faltered. "That's not what I meant. Number. But that's what you showed me, for years." The silence hung between them thicker than ever. "You sent me a text asking me not to be too serious," Evelyn said. "You warned me not to talk too much about what I do. And now you're surprised that I didn't feel the need to tell you the truth." Tessa flushed. "It just would have been nice to have a heads up." "I wouldn't have." "Wouldn't have seated me in the back?" Evelyn asked. "Wouldn't have introduced me as your cousin who works in legal something?" Grant looked away. "You didn't want the truth, Tessa. You wanted the version of me that fit your story. The version that didn't threaten the image you spent your life curating." "Time." Tessa opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had no comeback, no spin, no stage to control. And Evelyn? She didn't gloat. She didn't escalade. She simply rose from her chair quietly, with purpose, and met both of their gazes. "When people don't ask questions," she said, "they shouldn't be surprised by the answers they were never curious enough to hear." Then she turned and walked away. No drama. No declarations. Just the sound of her heels against the marble floor and the silence that followed her like an aftershock. She didn't need to be applauded. She didn't need to be forgiven. She needed only one thing: to no longer be mistaken for someone who'd accept being overlooked. And now, she never would be again. Evelyn didn't stay for dessert. She didn't linger for more speeches. She didn't circle the room, accepting apologies that never came or smiles that arrived too late. There was nothing left to collect, nothing left to prove. She walked out of the ballroom just as the string quartet began playing something delicate and forgettable. The air outside was cooler than she expected for late spring in Chicago. A breeze swept across the terrace as she stepped into it, lifting the hem of her dress, brushing past her like the faintest whisper of freedom. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble for her phone. She didn't check her reflection in the glass. She just stood still for a moment, breathing. Not like someone who had escaped, but like someone who had arrived fully, finally, and on her own terms. Inside, she imagined the aftermath. Tessa rewriting the evening in her head, scrambling to reclaim the center of a spotlight she no longer controlled. Grant trying to smooth the edges of his ego, wondering how he'd missed all the signs. Their guests searching Evelyn's name online, piecing together the story they should have known. But she didn't care. Not out of coldness, not out of pride, but because something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't waiting anymore. Not for recognition, not for understanding, not even for justice. She had already received what she came for. Not applause, not validation, just silence, the good kind. The kind that isn't awkward or empty. The kind that doesn't beg to be filled. The kind that says, "You've said enough, you've done enough. You can stop fighting now." Evelyn walked slowly down the steps, heels clicking against stone like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unspoken sentence. Each step felt lighter, freer. She reached the sidewalk, where her car was already waiting. The driver nodded, opened the door. She slid inside, and as the city lights blurred behind the tinted windows, she allowed herself the smallest smile. Not the kind that stretches wide and asks for attention. The kind that lives quietly in the corners of your mouth, earned, not performed. She didn't check her messages, but she knew they'd be there. A missed call from her mother. A text from Tessa, saying something like, "You could have told me. Why would you embarrass me like that?" But Evelyn wasn't embarrassed. She was at peace. Because for the first time, she had allowed the truth to speak without anger, without explanation, without compromise. And it was enough. She leaned back against the leather seat and closed her eyes. Not to sleep. Not to shut out the world. Just to feel it all settle, the noise, the years of dismissal, the quiet power of choosing not to shrink. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stormed out. She hadn't demanded to be seen. She had simply arrived as herself, and let the silence do the rest. And in that silence, she found something she hadn't known she was looking for. Not revenge, not redemption, but relief. Not everyone will recognize your growth. Some people will still see you as the version of yourself they feel most comfortable remembering. To them, you'll always be the quiet one, the too serious one, the girl who didn't play along, the woman who asked too many questions, took up too much space, or refused to shrink to fit the frame. And for a while, that hurts. Because we're human. Because deep down, most of us are just trying to be understood. To be known, not just seen. To be valued for who we are, not who others pretend we are. But there comes a point in life, usually quiet, usually unexpected, when you realize something powerful. You don't have to spend your life correcting other people's versions of you. You don't have to explain your success to the people who dismissed your potential. You don't have to justify your boundaries to the ones who never respected them. You don't have to shout your truth in rooms that were never willing to listen. You just have to live it. Because the loudest statement you can ever make is not noise. It's presence. It's walking into a space that once made you feel small, and taking up the room without apology. It's letting the truth exist without fanfare. It's showing up not to be recognized, but because you no longer need permission to belong. Evelyn Hart didn't need to argue her way into being seen. She simply became undeniable. And that's the lesson. Sometimes, the most transformative thing you can do isn't to fight harder. It's to stop asking for a seat at someone else's table and start building your own. Because the people who never asked about your journey don't get to define your arrival. The family that overlooked you, the colleagues who underestimated you, The friends who stopped checking in once your light started shining a little too brightly, they were never the measure of your worth. And if they couldn't see you then, that's on them. You're not here to prove anyone wrong. You're here to live like you know you're right. With grace, with silence, with steady, unshakable clarity. So let them talk. Let them revise the past. Let them tell their version. You don't need to rewrite their narrative. You just need to keep living yours. Loud in your purpose, quiet in your pride, and anchored in the kind of truth that doesn't fade when the spotlight moves on. Because the truth doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be lived. And your value? It was never up for debate.